The winter wind came in off the channel like a thief, silent for moments, then suddenly rattling shutters, creeping down chimneys, and carrying with it the sharp sting of salt and snow. The fishing town of Brackenford huddled against the gray sea, as though ashamed to meet its own horizon, its crooked lanes and weather-stained cottages bracing for another long night of winter siege. From her small classroom window, Margaret Hale could see the harbor masts swaying, the fishermen already hauling their nets into the sheds. The sky had the peculiar bruised shade that warned of a storm before sunset. She dismissed the children with extra haste, watching as they scurried down the frost-glazed path, woolen scarves trailing behind them like banners. Only one lingered at the doorway, her own boy, Thomas, shoulders hunched in his worn coat, eyes restless as the waves beyond the harbor wall. "Home," she said softly, brushing snow from his dark hair. "Straight home. There'll be no wandering today." He muttered something she couldn't quite catch, but she caught the glance he threw toward the distant cliffs, where the old lighthouse stood, black and skeletal against the pale sky.
The lighthouse had been unlit for years, its oil lamps cold since before Thomas was born. It had become the subject of local whispers, a place where gulls screamed even on calm days, and where the wind seemed to carry the sound of voices long dead. Margaret had warned him 100 times to stay away. She had reason for her fear. Her husband, William Hale, had perished on a storm night not unlike this, his fishing boat dashed to pieces somewhere between that cliff and the reef beyond. Officially, the sea had taken him, but there were murmurs of a quarrel at the tavern that evening, and of a figure seen climbing the lighthouse steps in the hours before the ship left harbor. No answers had ever come, only the certainty of loss.
By late afternoon, snow was falling in earnest, brushing the cobbles in white. Margaret had lit the fire and set the kettle to boil when there came a knock at the door. Sharp, deliberate, the kind that expected to be answered promptly. She opened it to find Mr. Arthur Pennington, the wealthiest merchant in Brackenford, his greatcoat dusted with snow, his gloved hands resting on the head of a silver-tipped cane. "Mrs. Hale," he began, inclining his head just enough to be polite. "I'll get straight to the point. That cottage of yours sits on the very strip of land I need for my new warehouse. You've turned down my offers before, but I'm prepared to be generous this time." Margaret folded her arms, the firelight at her back casting her shadow tall against the snow. "It's not for sale, Mr. Pennington. It was my husband's, and it will remain my son's." He smiled, not warmly. "The storm season is unkind to old houses. It would be a pity if the sea took this one as well." Her stomach tightened at the deliberate cruelty in his words, but she said nothing. He tipped his hat and walked away, his boots crunching on the frozen lane.
When Thomas came in an hour later, his cheeks were flushed from the cold, his boots carrying clumps of snow. Margaret noticed the damp hem of his trousers, too wet for someone who had merely walked home. "You've been near the cliffs again," she said, sharper than she intended. "I wasn't doing anything," he muttered, but his eyes avoided hers. "The lighthouse is dangerous," she pressed. "Rotten stairs, loose stones. You'll keep away from it, Thomas. Do you understand me?" Something in her tone, or perhaps in the unspoken history behind it, sparked defiance in him. "It's just a building. You're the one who's afraid, not me." Her hand tightened on the edge of the table. "If you knew what that place had taken from us." "I know you never tell me anything," he burst out, his voice cracking. "You talk about father like he was some saint, but no one in town says the same. They whisper about fights and lies, and you just pretend it's not true." The words cut more deeply than he could have guessed. "Enough," she said, low and final, but he had already grabbed his coat again. "Where are you going?" "Out," he shot back, pulling the door open. The cold wind rushed in, scattering papers from the table. Before she could stop him, he was gone into the snow, the darkness already closing over the lane.
The blizzard had come like a living thing, a wild, breathless force that swept in from the sea and swallowed the town in white. By the time Margaret had wrapped herself in her thick wool cloak and stepped outside, snow was already drifting knee-deep in the lane. She pulled her scarf over her mouth, her breath warm against the fabric, and peered into the swirling dark. No sign of Thomas. Only the faintest trace of footprints leading away from the cottage and up toward the hill that curved toward the cliffs. The wind tore at her skirts, tugged her hair loose from its pins. She pressed forward, head down, one gloved hand on the wall to steady herself. The sea's roar grew louder with every step, a deep, booming undertone beneath the shrill whistle of the wind.
The prints were half filled with snow already, and at times she feared she'd lost them. But always, just ahead, a faint indentation marked the way. She thought of Thomas, no hat, coat barely thick enough for this weather, and a sickness twisted in her stomach. A sudden shape loomed in the whiteness, the shadow of a man, broad-shouldered, with a thick oilskin coat and a sou'wester hat crusted with frost. He was standing at the fork in the path, a lantern clutched in one mittened hand.
"Mrs. Hale!" The voice was deep, hoarse, and unmistakable. Captain Elias Morrin, the old lighthouse keeper. His beard was stiff with ice, his eyes narrowed against the wind. "You'll lose yourself out here," he said, striding toward her. "The cliff path's half gone in places." "My boy," she began, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. "I saw him, passed me not 10 minutes ago, heading for the headland. Fool lad, I called to him, but the wind stole my voice." Margaret's breath caught. "Then you'll help me find him?" Morrin hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the cliff. "A storm like this, the lighthouse steps will be treacherous, and if he's gone inside—" He stopped, his jaw tightening. "All right, but we keep to the lower path, less exposed."
They trudged side by side, the lantern's small circle of light swaying ahead of them. The snow muffled all sound except the wind and the crunch of their boots. For a time they spoke nothing, until the silence pressed too heavily on Margaret. "You knew William," she said, the words half accusation, half plea. "I," Morrin answered, not looking at her, "knew him well enough." "Then tell me," she said, her voice hardening, "why you've avoided me since the night he died." His shoulders seemed to sag beneath the oilskin. "Because there's truth in the whispers, Mrs. Hale. Not the way the tavern gossips tell it, but enough to keep me awake these 12 years. She stopped walking. "Tell me." He kept his gaze on the path ahead. "The night your husband sailed, the beacon was dark. It should have been lit. There was a squall coming in. He came to me in the harbor, said he'd heard Pennington plan to sail a cargo ship through the reef to avoid customs, and he meant to stop him. Said I must light the lamp no matter what orders I'd been given. I didn't. I'd been told by the harbor master, bought by Pennington's coin, to keep it dark. When William's boat went out, I thought he'd stay inside the reef, but the wind pushed him toward the rocks. By the time I lit the lamp, it was too late." The confession hung between them, heavier than the snow. Margaret felt her knees weaken, but the thought of Thomas somewhere ahead kept her moving. The path narrowed as they climbed, the wind now so fierce that they had to lean into it. Morrin's lantern threw flickering light across a drift where something glinted, a small brass compass, its chain broken. Margaret bent to pick it up. "Thomas's," she said. "He took it from the shelf this morning." Morrin studied the drift ahead. "He's close, and if I know that boy's thinking, he's gone to light the beacon. There's a ship out there tonight. I heard her horn an hour past. He'll think he's helping." A fresh wave of dread washed through her.
The lighthouse was dangerous even in daylight, but in this storm?
They were perhaps 50 yards from the cliff edge when the path curved around a jut of rock. Morrin went first, testing the snow with his boot. "Careful here," he called, and then the earth gave way with a sound like tearing cloth. Margaret cried out as Morrin grabbed her arm, yanking her back. A section of the path, 3 yards wide, tumbled into the darkness below, swallowed by the roar of the sea. Spray leapt up to meet them, cold as knives. "No way across here," Morrin panted. "We'll have to climb higher, cut across the ridge." Margaret glanced upward. The ridge was steep, slick with snow, but there was no choice. They climbed, boots slipping, fingers numb even through gloves. The wind screamed around them, snatching their breath away.
At last they crested the ridge, and there, faint but unmistakable, a thin yellow glow winked from the lighthouse windows. Margaret's heart lurched. "He's there." "Aye," Morrin said grimly. "And if the lamp's alight, the stairs to it are still standing. For now." The two of them started down toward the black shape of the lighthouse, the snow swirling like ghosts between them and the sea. Somewhere in the darkness, the horn of an approaching ship moaned, long, low, and desperate. The storm had not yet reached its worst. The worst was yet to come.
The lighthouse loomed above them like a sentinel carved from black stone, its jagged outline blurred by the swirling snow. The waves below slammed against the cliff with such force that the ground seemed to tremble. Each crash rose like a drumbeat under the shrill wail of the wind. Margaret and Morrin reached the heavy oak door, its surface bleached by years of salt spray. It resisted at first, swollen with damp, but with a shove from Morrin's shoulder, it groaned open, spilling the dim yellow glow of an oil lamp into the storm. The air inside was colder than she expected, heavy with the scent of mildew and brine. Shadows from the lamp danced across the curved stone walls. "Thomas?" Her voice echoed upward, swallowed by the hollow shaft of the tower. From somewhere above came a faint cry, muffled, desperate. Margaret's heart seized. She mounted the first steps, but Morrin caught her arm. "Careful! Some of these stairs'll kill you quicker than the storm." They climbed slowly, the wood groaning under their weight. Snow had drifted in through broken panes, leaving patches of ice that sent them clinging to the rusted railing. Halfway up, Morrin halted abruptly, holding the lantern low. The beam fell on a jagged gap in the floor. Through it, they could see the stone base far below, and Thomas, sprawled on a narrow beam, one leg twisted awkwardly, a terrified grip on a splintered board.
"Don't move," Marguerite's voice trembled. "Mom," he called, his teeth chattering. "It broke. I can't get up." Morrin tested the edges of the gap. "Too wide to step, and the boards around it will give way if we're not careful." He glanced at the wall, where an old rope hung coiled like a forgotten snake. Marguerite seized it, tying it around her waist before Morrin could object. "You'll fall," he warned. "I'll reach him," she said, and there was a steel in her tone that silenced him. She lowered herself through the gap, boots braced against the wall. The rope burned against her gloves as she slid down until she was level with Thomas. "Take my hand, love, slowly now." His small fingers clutched hers with desperate strength. Inch by inch, she pulled him up, his face buried against her shoulder as she scrambled back onto the landing. Only when his feet were safely on the boards did she allow herself to breathe.
"We need to go," she urged, but Morrin shook his head. "There's a ship out there. I heard her horn again, closer this time. If we don't light the beacon, she'll hit the reef just as William's boat did." Margaret stared at him. "The stairs!" "I'll make it," he said, though the glance he cast at the upper steps was grim. She wanted to argue, but there was no time. The wind outside screamed like some furious creature, and faint through it came the ship's mournful horn. "Take the boy," Morrin said, pressing the lantern into her hands. "Get below. If the light doesn't burn in 5 minutes, leave and don't look back." Before she could speak, she was climbing. Morrin's figure was a shadow against the spiral, each step creaking beneath his boots. Higher and higher he went, the wind finding its way through every crack, setting the structure to moaning. Once he paused, bracing himself against the wall as a board splintered underfoot. Margaret held Thomas close, every muscle tense, watching that lone figure battle upward. At last, he reached the iron hatch. He forced it open, and the full fury of the storm crashed in. Snow whipping around him, his oil skin flapping like a torn sail. Through the hatch, she saw him wrestle with the lamp's mechanism, striking the flint, shielding the flame from the wind until it caught. And then, like the birth of a new sun, the beacon blazed. A golden beam cut through the white fury, sweeping across the black sea. Somewhere in the distance, a ship's horn sounded again, but this time there was a note of hope in it. Marguerite's relief was short-lived. Morrin staggered, clutching the railing. For a moment, he leaned against the lamp housing, gazing out toward the ship, and she knew, by the stillness in his posture, that he had found what he had been seeking all these years: redemption. The next moment, his grip slipped. He crumpled to his knees, then slid down against the iron frame. She started toward the stairs, but the wind slammed the hatch shut with a metallic clang that echoed through the tower. By the time she reached the upper platform, he was slumped against the wall, his face pale but peaceful. "Tell the boy I'm sorry, and tell William I kept my promise this time." His eyes closed, and the storm's howl filled the silence.
Brackenford never forgot that night. The ship made harbor safely, its captain swearing the light had appeared just in time. Margaret kept the lighthouse key in a small box on her mantle beside the brass compass. When Thomas grew into a young man, tall and steady-handed, he took the post of keeper himself. On winter nights, when the wind roared and the sea flung itself against the cliffs, he would climb the narrow stairs, light the beacon, and pause for a moment beside the brass plate bearing Morrin's name. And sometimes, when the glass panes trembled in the gale, he thought he heard the old man's voice, rough but kind, saying, "Hold fast, lad, the light's worth it."